Hi everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to be discussing green-black in Foundations. Green-black and green-blue are the worst performing and least drafted color pairs. Notably, Sultai is the most drafted three-color pair, so that's where some of the green-black and green-blue stuff is ending up, presumably. And it's very common for green, blue, and black to get played together in Limited these days. So it's not terribly surprising to see that Sultai's a common or the most common three-color pair, and people drifting into Sultai take some share of the green and black drafters, but that's not most of what's going on. Most of what's going on is that green is not very strong overall, and the green-black gold card is quite bad. Wardens of the Cycle, the 1 black, green, 3/4 with morbid, either lose a life and draw a card or gain 2 life. I feel like that card probably could have just been draw a card and gain a life, give you both the same time. And there's not really like a lot of coherent synergy in green black, even outside of its uncommon not being good. Like, to the extent that it has a thing, arguably its thing is supposed to be morbid. That's what's indicated on Wardens of the Cycle if you take that as like a signpost. But there are only 4 total morbid cards in the set in green and black, and all of them except Tragic Banshee are pretty bad. So you're not really doing a morbid thing. And even if you were, morbid has never really been much of a build-around mechanic in Limited. And if it were, green-black wouldn't really be that good a home for it, because the removal tends to be on the slightly more expensive side, and there aren't like great ways to enable it, especially with the like modern design philosophy shift to like not print free sacrifice outlets for the most part. So even if you're sacrificing your own creature to turn on morbid, you still need extra mana to do that, which means that the best way to make morbid happen is just to trade creatures in combat. That generally happens on the attacker's turn, and green and black is generally going to be more defensive, so most of the creature trading is going to happen on your opponent's turn, so it's going to be relatively hard to trigger morbid on your turn. You can try to draft a more aggressive deck, and you can play creatures that force trades in combat more. Creatures with more power than toughness, like Wary Thespian, the 1 and a green 3/1 that surveils when it enters or dies, or Ambush Wolf, the 3 mana 4/2 flash that exiles a card from a graveyard when it enters, 3 mana 4/2 flash. You can attack with those, and your opponent will be pretty incentivized to trade rather than taking a bunch of damage, and then that can trigger a morbid thing. Or you can play Vampire Gourmand, the uncommon 2 mana 2/2 that when it attacks you can sacrifice a creature to draw a card and it becomes unblockable. That's a free sacrifice outlet. It's a strong uncommon, it's hard to get, and green-black's not really the best home for it. But hypothetically, it is a good morbid enabler if that's something you're trying to do. But as much as morbid like thematically fits green-black, mechanically, I wish they would stop trying to make it a green-black mechanic sometimes, because they don't make green-black like aggressive enough that it's usually the attacker, so it ends up just being very awkward to try to trigger. So there aren't that many morbid cards. You can basically just ignore this thing, but all of that just means that when you play green-black, you're just kind of playing a bunch of cards together, and they don't have a lot of like coherent overlap. There is Zombify, and there's the Elvish Regrower, the 2 green green 4/3 ETB return a permanent from your graveyard to your hand. Those both get things back from the graveyard. But as far as combining that with like some sort of self-mill type thing, which is often green-black space, as far as like green enablers for filling your graveyard, you're basically just looking at Wary Thespian. So there's not like a lot of putting stuff in your graveyard and taking it out of your graveyard. The sacrifice type stuff that exists in black generally pairs better with red or white. So you basically just have a bunch of independent cards, which isn't terrible for green black. It's pretty normal for green black to play a lot of removal and like big creatures and try to disrupt your opponent's synergies and game plans, and then just kind of win with individual card power. And that's basically what you have to try to do here. So I basically think that you want to be drafting this as a Snare Spinner control deck and not really trying to go out of your way to take morbid creatures or things to make morbid happen, or, as is the recurring theme in this set, really anything that is highly synergistic can kind of be included loosely as an afterthought, but shouldn't be a driving force in your draft. This deck is going to be looking for things that are very similar to the multicolor green control decks that I discussed in the previous episode last week. The big difference here, or why would you be straight green-black, is basically answered by the fact that there are good black cards that cost black that show up more often than cards in other colors. So specifically, like Bake Into a Pie, the common 2 black destroy target creature, make a food, and Vampire Nighthawk, the uncommon 2/3 flying lifelink death touch. Those ask for a lot of black mana sources, and I talked about how Llanowar Elves is not a great card in the multicolor green decks because it needs green mana to cast and then gives you green mana, and when you're trying to get a lot of colors out of your mana base, that can be worse than just having a land that's a different color. So if you are just green-black, then you can use Llanowar Elves and you can play the double black cards. And what you're trying to do with those cards is pretty similar to what the multicolor green decks are trying to do. But when black is very open and you can get the removal that you need out of black, or when fixing is not very available, then you might want to have like a similar philosophy, but be straight green-black or heavily green-black with maybe a light splash somewhere else, depending on what removal you're seeing and what kind of fixing you're seeing. And that's the way to draft green-black as far as I'm concerned. I don't think it's worth trying to push the elf stuff. I don't think it's worth trying to push the morbid stuff. I don't think it's worth trying to like find a way to make some tokens and overrun in green-black. I think you're basically just playing reasonable rate defensive creatures, all the green and black removal you can find, and taking advantage of the fact that you can reasonably cast Bake Into a Pie. And then the other major concern is 2-drops. The 2-drops that are available mostly have really awful stats in green-black, but you really want to do something on 2. It's very easy for these decks to be problematically clunky. So as far as commons go, I think you want to value Wary Thespian, Burglar Rat, and Llanowar Elves more highly than you normally would, also Infestation Sage, so that you can have an early game without needing to play stuff like the Gnarlid and the Sanguine Siphoner and whatever other random 2-drops are available that don't do very well. Of course, this deck splashes well. Often when you're splashing, you're just pivoting into last week's episode. You're just becoming a multicolor green deck. Kind of the driving force to be straight green-black, again, I really think is mostly just if you get like Bake into a Pie and or Nighthawk early, and it stretches your mana enough that it's going to be hard to play more colors, then you can kind of stick to green-black. But all of the same, like you're still playing the same basic game plan. You're still generally trying to make the game go long, generally looking for cards that work well in a long game, cards that lead to board stalls, avoiding a lot of the kind of like smaller game synergy sack type stuff, while including like a little bit of it just to have early game, but not like going so far as to play Hungry Ghouls and stuff. And yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward. I think that where green black is it's not a very good archetype. You shouldn't draft it very often. No one's confused about that. It doesn't get drafted very often. If you are in a seat that should draft it, don't try to do fancy green-black specific stuff. Just take the good cards that you can cast and cast them. There's not a theme or mechanic. There's not really a secret aggro deck here. I've seen some like elf-heavy green-black decks. If you get some Llanowar elves, like if you end up, like if somehow you have a bunch of Llanowar elves after pack 1, maybe that's what gets you into green and you end up with like 3 Llanowar elves. And then I could see a situation where you start taking like Dwinnen's Elites and the 3/3 Trampler that gets bigger when a creature enters. And then that can lead to like an aggressive deck. Black's not offering a lot to that. It sounds like your deck is going to be like mostly green, and then you might incidentally have like some black removal or whatever to support it. I think like some small portion of the time you'll end up in an elf lane. It's fine if there are black cards in there. I would think of my archetype there as like green X elves. And green X elves isn't ever something I would expect to be able to draft, but is like the kind of thing that you might, fall into in 1% of your drafts or whatever, especially if you're open to drafting green. But yeah, there's not like a ton to say here. You're like, I think Giant Growth's not where you want to be, but Rabid Bite's pretty good. If you can get it, Snakeskin Veil is a much better trick here than Giant Growth because you're more likely to have, like Snare Spinners that play pretty well with Veil because they're worth protecting and they're going to kill whatever they're in combat with anyway. And like they have enough toughness that usually one more toughness is going to be enough to save them. So, yeah, those are my thoughts. I'm going to turn it over to chat for questions here. First, I do want to thank the newest patron, Kevin. Thank you very much. Really appreciate the support. If anyone else is looking to support the podcast, check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. And I'm going to get straight into questions. Is there an elf lane with Infestation Sage and way to sacrifice Dwinnen's Elite tokens? That, I mean, it could technically happen. Looking into some stats, like Hungry Ghoul has a really bad win rate in green-black, but over a tiny sample size, the Threaten has a really good win rate. So it's possible that, like, you can be, like, Jund, Steal, and Sack with a token thing and some Sack outlets and make something cool happen there. And there are cards that support that stuff, kind of, except that like Dwinnen's Elite is pretty hard to make work, and the payoff for having a bunch of tokens and sacrificing them is like pretty small. The sack outlets just like aren't very good and don't do that much for you. It would probably be better to just like try to overrun with that setup if you can. Overrun is a fine card in this like setup. Like you have a bunch of reasonably large creatures, you have defensive creatures, you're trying to establish a board stall, you're not stretching your mana, so the green's not a deal breaker. But Overrun isn't a great card. Like it's not something you want in most of your green black decks. You need like actual token makers, I think, to want it, because it's really narrow in what it does. It can't help you stabilize or stay alive. It wins late games where you've already established a board stall and you want to draft your deck such that you're like favored in those spots regardless, and you'd rather just take over with a Snare Spinner rather than killing them immediately with an Overrun, because the Snare Spinner will let you not die to flying creatures, which Overrun won't. Do I think part of the reason green-black is not a super winning archetype is related to it having a non-bird signpost uncommon? I mean, I do think it's related to it not having a good signpost uncommon, and to its signpost uncommon being largely misleading and or a trap and suggesting that you could or should do something that it doesn't really support. That's all I have to say about the non-bird part. I feel like you never get past enough elves to make an elf deck. I basically agree. Do you find that green-black really hurts for card draw? If yes, does that make Seeker's Folly and Burglar Rat even more valuable? So, acknowledging that Seeker's Folly and Burglar Rat, Seeker's Folly is the mind rot, target player discards two cards, or all of their creatures get -1/-1, and Burglar Rat's the 1/1 that makes them discard a card. Acknowledging that those exist in a similar space to card draw, so card advantage. I guess hurting for card draw, is that a thing? Is kind of my starting point here. And if it is a thing, does ways to generate card advantage directly address it? So part of what card draw is doing is it's like helping you make your land drops and find your good cards. And card advantage in the form of like 2-for-1s or like things that answer your opponent's cards in an object positive rate don't replace those things that card draw gives you, at least not directly. However, slowing your opponent down does potentially give you more draw steps, which does give you more time to make your land drops and find your good cards. So it's mostly fair to treat those as analogous to card draw. As far as is green-black hurting for card draw, I think theoretically green-black is looking to win on virtual rather than practical card advantage more often than not. Green-black generally has large, high-impact creatures that your opponent will theoretically have to use multiple cards to deal with, or that will stop multiple attackers. So, is virtual card advantage enough, or do you generally need to supplement it with practical or like hard card advantage? I don't think you have to. Mostly, I think Burglar Rat is more valuable because it's a productive 2-mana play that's not terrible. And I think Seeker's Folly is not more valuable because it's relatively clunky and when it's in discard mode doesn't affect the board. And I'm kind of afraid of my green-black decks being too slow to affect the board. So I don't think I'm excited about Seeker's Folly as a way to address the concern here. I think I'm more interested in just like having a little bit higher card quality, or at least a little, more strong cards than my opponent, and then playing a 3 mana card that will trade with a card on the board to prolong the game over playing Seeker's Folly most of the time. What is a good reason to draft green black? As I discussed, I really think the best reason to draft straight green black is double pip removal and or lack of fixing. Like there's because I want to do the same thing with green black that I'm doing with multicolor green, and I believe that it's relatively easy and effective to draft multicolor green. To me, the real question is, if green black, why are you green black and not green X? And the answer is mostly that the black spells are hard to cast, so it's hard to splash a bunch of other colors. And so, to me, the good reason to draft green black is you value casting these black spells, and it's hard to do that if you play more colors. Compared to last week, I assume you don't want Grow from the Ashes in green black. Are there any other notable cards that are worse in green black aside from off-color cards? You're absolutely right about Grow from the Ashes. Grow from the Ashes is pretty bad if it's not doing like a lot of very serious work fixing. As far as other green and black cards that change value here, nothing immediately springs to mind. I think that's like the really big one. I mean, Bushwhack, I guess, is the other one that's like a lot of its value is from fixing, and given that you're not as concerned about doing that, you want it less. Although I think that like green black splash white or green black splash blue or even green black splash red are fairly common, and Bushwhack's not terrible in those decks. So Grow from the Ashes is probably the biggest card that you like would have wanted. Like when thinking about pivoting between these decks, like I'd still probably take a Grow from the Ashes late in pack one, unless I'm very sure that I don't want to be splashing, just to have the opportunity to splash if it comes up. But then when I take that, if I end up not splashing, I'm certainly going to try pretty hard not to put it in my straight green black deck. Like I basically just won't do it. I'd rather play a basic land, like my 18th land over that. How many elves would be enough to get past to make an elf deck? Like a rough range. This is just a what constitutes an elf deck to you question. I suspect that the real question here is like, how many other elves do you need for Dwynen's Elite? And the problem with that question is that you're usually playing Dwynen's Elite to have an acceptable 2-drop, and like you're more likely to play it because you just like didn't get enough cheap cards than because you like reliably think you're actually going to get an elf out of it. And so it's hard to say you need this many elves to play Dwynen's Elite, because it's really like some weird calculus of your other options are bad, your curve is bad, and you have enough elves that you'll spike sometimes. So I don't, like, I get that you're looking for a rough range, but I still don't have a rough range for you on making an elf deck. Why is 9 Lives Familiar 4 points lower in green-black than generally? It's a pretty grindy card. Obviously not a specific card I've studied deeply, but what I'll say is black-red is more likely to be actively looking to play sacrifice stuff to pair with it than black-green, since like the steal and sack thing exists. And so your like Hungry Ghouls and Ravenous Amulets are going to make more sense in your deck, and you're going to play more of them, and 9 Lives Familiar is going to work better with them. as far as like how good it is with white or blue, I suspect it just isn't played very much in green blue or in blue black. And so that just constitutes a very small portion of its total numbers. I suspect a lot of this is just green black winning less than black white. So it ends up winning more often in black white than in green white just because it's like a better color combination. It might have some more applications with like the general go wide stuff that's available there. You get like life gain triggers on Dazzling Angel when your 9 lives familiar dies in white black, which can actually add up to something that matters. I think green black is kind of better at having the ground covered and like dying in the air or like, basically like the spots that green black is losing, 9 lives familiar might not be helping you in. And it's not contributing toward you winning in any meaningful way. Like you're going to be attacking on the ground and it's not going to be contributing. I think that's most of what I have to say about contemplating 9 lives familiar in green black. Does Llanowar Elves let you cut 2 drops on a 1-to-1 basis? So you basically are unlikely to get the number of cheap plays you'd really want, especially if you're only willing to play good cards. Llanowar Elves is a good cheap play that allows you to play 3 drops onto to forgive not having enough cheap plays. I don't know that letting you cut is the best way to think about it, but certainly if I have a number in my head, like if I want 6 2 drops, but I'm using that loosely to mean like 1 and 2 drops, then Llanowar Elves certainly counts as one of them. It counts as like it forgives not having a 2-drop more directly than Infestation Sage, but not necessarily all that meaningfully. Like I'm still mostly just looking at like, do I have enough ability to get onto the board early? And if I like play Infestation Sage and then miss my 2-drop, I'm not happy about missing my 2-drop, but it's like a lot less bad than if I didn't have a 1-drop. So I think Llanowar Elves is certainly a better 1-drop and better at forgiving having fewer 2s than Infestation Sage, but not like a full card better, like a full 2-mana card in your deck better or whatever, I think. Does Elvish Regrower need self-mill support? No. It's a 4-mana 4/3. It's certainly, you really want to return something with it, but it's just like very good. So I'm certainly not going to say I would only play it if I had like Wary Thespian or similar in my deck. And, like Ambush Wolf is like pretty close to being self-mill just because you play it and it's super easy to trade off with it. Similarly, like Evolving Wilds is like guaranteed value for Elvish Regrower. So I do think that Elvish Regrower appreciates having Evolving Wilds and Wary Thespians and creatures with more power than toughness. But you basically just like plan to cast it as like the last spell in your hand, and you're usually going to have a graveyard. Have I ever been forced to cast it as a vanilla 4/3? I don't think I have. Seems like the 4-drop slot could be pretty packed in green black. Absolutely, yes. It certainly is, that's where a lot of my concerns about the deck being too clunky come from, and why I want to prioritize 2s. I'm generally a bit of a Soul Shackle Zombie, I think is the name. The 4-mana 4/2 exile 2 things. If you exile a creature, drain your opponent for 2. Apologist. I certainly am not looking to play that card in green black. You really want to be playing, Snare Spinners and Regrower and Bake instead. And then, that's also why, like, I don't think you ever want to work to make Cackling Prowler, the 4-mana 4/3 ward to morbid, get a +1/+1 counter. Like, you don't want to try to play that card or work to play that card because there are a bunch of other better 4-mana spells you can play instead, and you're generally going to be like looking to take things that cost not 4 a lot more than you're looking to take things that cost 4. Are there any black cards you would put less of a premium on in green-black? I don't know that I would say that I was putting a premium on that zombie, but it's certainly a black card that I like less in green-black because of the expectations about the curve and the fact that I want as many Snare Spinners as I could get. Like, I think a big part of what I'm thinking about with green-black is there are too many 4s, so I want to not take them. But there are too many 4s, so I want to not take them because I'm trying to take as many Snare Spinners and Bake into a Pies as possible. So it's not exactly that I want to deprioritize Bake as I want to prioritize Bake and deprioritize everything else. But then you have stuff like Elvish Rigor and Zombify that are pretty good and play pretty well there, and you end up playing them too. So that's just further reason that you really need to like deprioritize the other stuff that costs 4. Outside of that, I guess like it kind of depends on what your baseline is. Like, if you draft a lot of black red or some versions of black white, you might be prioritizing Hungry Ghoul, and you don't want to do that in green black. So I guess just kind of like the like okay rate random black creatures that don't fly, I think are a little bit worse. You're winning in a more like over the top way rather than by like finding a way to make productive attacks with 2 and 3 mana black creatures. So you don't really value the 2 and 3 mana black creatures that can attack in some other archetypes. So yeah, 4-drops and aggressive things, I think, in black are the ones that I would value less in green-black. Same with green, like the green 4-drops that aren't Spider and the aggressive green cards like the Trample Elf, the 3-mana one. I think I'm valuing those both a little bit lower in black-green than I might in other green decks, especially like green-red. Not really looking for combat tricks, like not looking for Fake Your Own Death or Giant Growth, mostly because I'm worried about having real removal and worried about being too clunky to like get combat tricks to line up properly. So again, I'm pretty good with Snakeskin Veil to protect my like good defensive creatures. Need a lot of removal for this deck. I'm not generally one to obsess about removal count the way that I've seen some people do. Like, if I have a deck that doesn't have removal, I don't always think that that's terrible. However, I do think that green-black wants a lot of removal. I do think that removal is good in this set. I do think that you should prioritize removal. I think you should be willing to splash for removal. I think you should prioritize taking bite downs and Bake into a Pies and stabs and to some extent bushwhacks. So I would say yes, you generally place a high value on removal for this deck. Oh, Hero's Downfall is another like black card that's pretty good, not great, but contributes to like having enough density of black cards that you want to be 2-color. When I was talking about Bake into a Pie and Nighthawk, I didn't mean to be like, it wasn't intentionally leaving Hero's Downfall out. It's basically the same. It's really kind of the same card as those two. Like, I value all of them very similarly. There's a question about Snare Spinners from other sets, or like how to identify excellent board stall creatures from average ones. I mentioned before, like in the last podcast, I think, that Blight Widow, which is a very old card, that is also a 4-mana X4 with Reach and Death Touch. In this case, it's 2/4 and also has like Infect. But Reach is really important. Death touch is moderately important. Like the fact that your opponent, like with a normal spider, your opponent can just send a bunch of 3/3s into it and push some damage and not lose anything. Whereas with Snare Spinner, if they want to attack, they're committing to, like, you get to kill whatever attacker you want with the Snare Spinner. So it's, like, very hard to push damage through Snare Spinner if you can't kill it, and then it's hard to kill because it has a lot of toughness. And then on top of all of that, the activated ability being something that, like, doesn't tap and, like, just mana sync, like, in general, mana sync plus board stall is a combo, right? Like, if you can make it so that nobody can attack and you have something productive to spend your mana on, that's quite good. It's rare to see that all in one card. I can't, like, there's not another, this is fantastic at blocking and also a reasonable mana sink from the past that's coming to mind. Like, Squad Rallier is doing something similar, but crucially doesn't have reach. It's like a little bit better as a mana sink and a little bit worse as a board staller. So those are the things about Snare Spinner that I like that you could look for, but it's kind of like, it's not super common that a card's as good at doing what it's doing as it is. Is the bad win rate in this color combo solved at all by building it more properly than is being done on average? I would certainly expect, like, I do think that this is the right or a better way to build it, and I do think that you'll win more if you build your deck better. Is it solved? I do think green-black is a weak archetype. I don't think that, like, knowing, these simple tricks will fix your green-black and make it, like, something that you should be actively looking to draft. So I guess I would use addressed more than I would use solved. Yeah. You don't want your green decks to be aggressive. Do you think that aggressive green decks are not good, or is it mostly personal preference? I think that the aggressive green cards don't pair very well with the black cards. And I personally like the defensive tools and fixing that green offers and think that those go well in defensive decks. I do think that there are reasonable aggressive tools in green that pair well with red and white cards. And I think that red-green and green-white can coherently be drafted as strong aggressive decks. I just don't think that that's something that you generally want to be trying to do with black cards, and it's also certainly not something you want to do in multicolor green decks. It is also a personal preference that I don't want my green decks to be aggressive based on the green cards that I like to value and the cards in general that I like to value. But I do think that, like, green has the potential to be aggressive in this format. I just don't think that black is a good support color for green decks that are trying to be aggressive. Seeing no more questions, I'm going to wrap it up there. So, thanks everyone for listening. At some point, I need to figure out the schedule on the Arena Opens. I've decided that I should do at least one Pioneer Masters episode before the Pioneer Masters Open. So that is to say that I, at this moment, think that I'll be covering Foundations next week, but I'm not sure about that, and I need to look into the schedule a little bit more to confirm. So that's all for now. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week. Bye.
Prepare for light speed.